For more videos on people's struggles, please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Lebanon is the target of a fresh diplomatic and financial assault by Saudi Arabia and its allies in the region. Towards the end of October, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain and Kuwait withdrew their ambassadors from Lebanon and also expelled Lebanese envoys. Saudi Arabia also proceeded to ban all imports from Lebanon. The purported reason for this was comments by Lebanese Information Minister George Kordahi, which criticized the Saudi-led war in Yemen. Incidentally, these remarks were made before Kordahi became a minister. However, this has not stopped the Gulf countries from taking these actions against Lebanon, which is already going through a very severe financial crisis. While the minister's comments were the stated reason, the Saudi actions come in the context of a regional dynamic, where it sees Lebanon and its dominant political force Hezbollah as a major threat. What is the background for these actions by Saudi Arabia and its Gulf allies? Is there more to this than just the comments of one individual? Rania Khalik of Breakthrough News explains.
So Saudi Arabia's recent assault on Lebanon isn't just, part of an ongoing escalation necessarily. Saudi Arabia has basically launched this assault on Lebanon where it's in fact bullied its other Gulf allies into participating in helping squeeze Lebanon while it's already essentially on its knees. Lebanon has a collapsing economy. And a part of the reason the Lebanese economy is collapsing is, of course, because it had this Ponzi scheme economy that was, inevitably always going to come tumbling down at some point, where it was constantly dependent on ongoing influx of capital from the outside to keep the Ponzi scheme going. And once that capital is cut off, as a Ponzi scheme does, the house of cards falls. Now, the thing is, part of the revenue stream that Lebanese economic Ponzi scheme was relying on was the Gulf states. Over and over since the end of the civil war in Lebanon in the 90s, the Gulf states have basically helped inject money into Lebanon whenever it was facing an economic crisis to help keep its Ponzi scheme economy going. And part of that was because they were invested in trying to maintain their clients in Lebanon to use against America's adversaries in the region, particularly Iran. But in the last several years, the Saudis basically decided that all of their investments in Lebanon and these local politicians to push their agenda had failed. And to people, investments into people like Saad Hariri have been an utter failure. And Hezbollah, which is the group that they view as their biggest enemy in Lebanon, is still powerful. It's still in government. It still has a huge base of support, despite all of America and Israel and Saudi Arabia's efforts. And so Saudi Arabia and its other Gulf allies began years ago to disinvest in Lebanon because they basically gave up on their local allies and decided, you know what? Let the economy crash and that'll just take Hezbollah down with it. And the economy has been crashing for the last couple of years, but Hezbollah hasn't gone away. Hezbollah still exists. Hezbollah is still powerful across the region. And one thing that's really upset Saudi Arabia is Hezbollah has played a role assisting the Houthis in Yemen, who the Saudis obviously are involved in this really horrible genocidal war against in Yemen, have been completely destroying the country. And the Saudis have failed to defeat the Houthis. And they blame Iran and they really blame Hezbollah. And so what happened recently with the Saudi assault on Lebanon, they say it was because the Lebanese information minister, this guy, George Kordahi, that he had criticized the Saudi war in Yemen and that was unacceptable. But the fact of the matter is he made those comments months ago before he was even in the Lebanese government. And this was just a pretext. This was a pretext for Saudi Arabia to squeeze Lebanon, like I said, while it's already on its knees. Lebanon, the economy is in complete shambles. There's no one coming to the rescue this time. And the country is really hurting. And Saudi Arabia has decided to really tighten the noose on Lebanon. And what they did is they didn't just cut diplomatic ties with Lebanon over these comments that, even American senators and Congress people criticize the Saudi war in Yemen. It's really not that big of a deal what this guy said. What it's really about is severing also the economic ties with Lebanon. So they've said, you know what? You guys cannot import anything to our country anymore. And what that's going to do is that's going to hurt the Lebanese economy even more than it already is. And of course, in Saudi Arabia live hundreds of thousands of Lebanese who work there in professional capacities, and they send remittances back home to Lebanon. And so the Lebanese are really dependent on remittances right now because of this economic collapse. And so Saudi Arabia has also been threatening to basically take these workers that work in Saudi Arabia and use them, which they already treat as hostages, and deport them. And this would threaten the Lebanese economy even more. So at the end of the day, what this is really about is it's really about helping crush Lebanon even further. And ultimately, the purpose of that is to try to destroy Hezbollah, which is honestly just futile.
After the punitive actions by the Gulf countries, there have been diplomatic attempts to resolve the situation. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Najib Mikati and some sections of the Lebanese political establishment have hinted or openly called for George Kordahi's resignation. Hezbollah and its allies have defended the minister. What lies ahead for Lebanon's political establishment? Will various sectors unite at this moment of crisis? What is the path ahead for Hezbollah specifically, which remains one of the most important players in Lebanon's politics and the region? Rania talks about these issues.
So the Lebanese political establishment is quite polarized. They fall into two different camps. And one of those camps is the sort of pro-American, pro-French, pro-Saudi camp, the pro-imperialist camp, essentially. And these people, they still have power. They still run a lot of Lebanon. They run the judiciary. They run, a lot of them are in the intelligence sector. They make up a lot of the government. These people will never agree with the other camp. And the other camp is the pro-resistance camp, the pro-Hezbollah camp, the pro-Iran camp, the camp that supports standing up to Saudi, Israeli, and American dictates and hegemony in the region. And this has really been the point of fracture inside the Lebanese political class for the last couple of decades. And so it's very difficult to see these two sides ever unifying. However, there are some things they are unified around, and that is, the IMF loan. They both want to access loans for Lebanon because Lebanon's in desperate need of them, right? And there's some small things that they're in unity over, like they're in unity over having a functioning government and things like this. But at the end of the day, that fault line, the sort of pro-anti-imperialist fault line, makes it really difficult for the country to function. And that's a situation it's been in for the last several years, actually, because the people who are on the pro-imperialist side, they really are clients of the Saudis, of the French, of the Germans. I mean, the Germans are some of the most interventionist at the moment in Lebanese politics. Like, you don't really hear about it. And then there's, this other aspect of the Lebanese, I wouldn't say political class, but sort of like a ruling class, which actually isn't in government, but sits outside of it. And these are the civil society people. These are the NGO people. These are the people that are funded by the West. It's Western funded civil society and NGO groups funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, by Open Society, by Ford Foundation, by the sort of the German embassy, the long list of characters that we've come to understand, fund civil society and NGOs in developing countries to really pacify any real resistance to ruling elites, but also push their agenda. And they call themselves the opposition. And they kind of, even though they call themselves the opposition, their viewpoints and what they're pushing for ultimately fall in line with that pro-imperialist camp I talked about. And so because of this, I really don't see Lebanon having a unified position. Lebanon's an intentionally weak state, and it stays weak because of this polarization that makes it impossible to push just to really make decisions in the country, to govern. And that's a situation Lebanon's stuck with. And then you have, what does that mean for Hezbollah and its allies? Hezbollah obviously is a very powerful political party, not just a powerful armed group. It's been elected to government repeatedly since 2005. And, now it has the strongest, biggest coalition bloc with its allies, the Free Patriotic Movement, which is a Christian party, and the ML movement, which is another Shia party, and the Muradad movement, which is another Christian party. And so it can't, a lot of people will accuse Hezbollah of you're not doing enough. But Hezbollah, at the end of the day, might have the biggest governing coalition, but it doesn't control the government, right? It can't actually make it can't actually move the country because you're still relying on all the other people in government. So what that means for Lebanon is, as far as governing goes, Lebanon, as long as it has this system in place, and as long as, honestly, it has all of this foreign interference where there's people who are getting millions of dollars and, campaign consultants and support from these outside imperialist countries, as long as that's the situation in Lebanon, you're really never going to have a unified government that stands up to these things as like one voice.